Great. Thanks, everybody. And apologies for for the technical confusion. We had a little gap getting to Ghana and back. So now we've got everybody connected back in. And I want to welcome everybody and thank Tori for her introductory remarks and congratulate her on all the work going into today's event and our partnership with Social Enterprise World Forum in co-hosting this with us. And we're very, very excited. The fact that we've had over 200 people register from a really diverse participation. And it's really amazing when we think about the significance of this kind of international initiative and the fact that we can bring voices together. When we launched Bisocial Canada a few years ago, we would never have been able to imagine or envision the support and the growth we've seen. The whole idea of using the demand side of the market to create social value was such a new concept and not very well understood. And I always laugh about the fact that when we started this, I had to learn how to spell RFP. That was a whole new concept to many of us. And at our first event in Vancouver, when we launched Bisocial Canada, a colleague from a social purpose business came up to me and said, wouldn't it be nice someday if we can have this event and we don't look around the room and see the same 35 people who've been working on this for some years. So it's really gratifying to realize the size of the event today, the diversity of the event, and how we've moved forward, because it's really hard when we think about the concept of social procurement that we try to explain that to people and we try different models and we're learning. When they say things like, oh, well, that's easy. It's social innovation applied to the marketplace. Well, that works for a very, very few number of people. So this ability for us to demythologize and to look at how we got here, it's really been quite an amazing and different path. And I think today we really want to celebrate some of those amazing accomplishments. I mean, things like a mandate for social procurement in the federal minister's mandate letter, amazing provincial initiatives that we've seen across the country. And I have to say, in the last couple of years, the amazing leadership of municipalities across the country, leadership from Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, the Coastal Community Social Procurement Initiative with 29 participants now, Toronto, Halifax, Winnipeg, Peterborough, Brampton, Ottawa. It's just going and going and going. And then, as Tori mentioned, you know, the participation and leadership of corporations like SAP, a software company, and Shandos, a construction company, two ends of the entire spectrum, really moving forward. And I think the other thing, as hard as COVID has been on all of us, one of the great things about the events in COVID is everyone now knows what a supply chain is. Everyone understands that what we can do is we actually can use how we buy things to create value. But we also recognize that we have so much more to do. We often talk about why we use procurement because of the ripple effect of what we do. And now we're starting to realize that not only is it the ripple effect and the influencing of purchasing, but we're starting to see the influence and the ripple effect of even things like policy statements and RFP language. Just last week, a corporation called and said, we just looked at an RFP. The RFP asked us what was our social procurement strategy. So now I'm trying to learn what that is. So the influence of everything from the smallest piece of with language in an RFP to events like this to mandate letters in the federal government. We also are seeing amazingly how social enterprise market share is growing as social procurement grows. You saw the video at the beginning with groups like Embers and Build, and we're seeing Equitable. And as their businesses grow, their social impact grows. But merely, counting the number of social enterprises isn't what we're trying to do. We're trying to improve their market share because as market share for social enterprises and social value businesses grows, we create healthier communities. But now we have some challenges as well. As we move through the next stages, I think we're going to have to be very, very aware that as everyone starts to say, I want to be on the bandwagon, we'll have to make sure that as people claim their place, that they're actually participating. And everyone can find a place, and we have to make that happen. But we have to be aware. We have to be aware of that social washing does not become a shield for shallow efforts. And as we grow and build and we recognize the diversity of supply chains, we also recognize that the outcomes and the impacts are really, really significant of what we have to do to create social value. We can't have social procurement without inclusion and income equity as part of the equation. And while we try to make and train and work and do training around how to make the process simple, efficient, and collaborative, it's difficult because we're actually addressing some very complex issues. And we see that influence moving from the tiniest effort of language in an RFP to the larger impact of someone getting a job on a work site. We're not just shifting the language, though, in procurement. We are shifting the core purpose of what the market can do. And so how we use the mechanics of an RFP are really about building another tool to create social value and the creation and the effect it can have on the marketplace. So we also have to be aware that we have to move from merely compliance of bidders to the enthusiastic engagement in social procurement. So we're building this together. And today we're going to go through and talk about some of the threads and hear of some of the successes. We're going to hear about some of the challenges and how we can work together to move forward. And I want to begin today with a few minutes talking to, I think we're going to do the big picture first, Lorenzo and Victor, okay? Bring you on and kind of look at what frame this discussion for the day. And let me start, Lorenzo, if you want to take a minute or take a few minutes and introduce yourself. And can you give us a perspective of where the federal government is going? That's about as big as we can get with this discussion today, I think.
Great. Thank you, David. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. So thank you for having me. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Mon nom est Lorenzo et c'est un plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. My name is Lorenzo and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm the Acting Assistant Deputy Minister in Public Services and Procurement Canada, and I work in the field of procurement. So to answer your question, David, Government of Canada, probably, highest level we can talk about right now other than moving to international. So just really quickly, just to situate all the participants, of course, Public Services and Procurement Canada has a number of functions and activities that it undertakes. And one of the key ones is we buy on behalf of other federal departments and agencies. And we buy everything from pens, papers, and office furniture, all the way up to the most advanced satellite equipment you can think of, and pretty much everything in between. From the Government of Canada's perspective, particularly with regards to Public Services and Procurement Canada, as you mentioned, David, I think we've seen a lot of movement over the course of the last couple of years. You mentioned Minister's mandate letter. So the subsequent mandate letters of the Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada identified Indigenous procurement and social procurements as being areas that we need to continue to move on and move forward on. Many of you will have seen the federal budget that was announced a week ago that talked about and included some additional funding for us to be able to continue to move forward in the field of social procurement. And this builds on some of the work that we have done over the past couple of years, which hopefully we'll get a chance to speak to in a little bit. So I think that from at least our perspective within Public Services and Procurement Canada, I think there's a real interest and a desire to continue to move forward. We've made some important strides, but I think, as you mentioned, David, there's a lot of work that remains to be done to move forward in this area. And that's why I'm so pleased to be part of today's event, because it's through events like this that we are able to learn from others, including municipal and provincial jurisdictions and other international partners who have done things and tried new things. But more importantly, to be able to hear from underrepresented groups and their experiences when it comes to federal procurement and what some of the opportunities or challenges are in this field as we look to be able to continue to move forward. So again, just want to say what a pleasure and an honor it is to be here today. So thank you.
Thanks, Lorenzo. And it's been great working with you and your team. I have to say, over the years, we've had such great collaboration with the federal public servants around this, as we all have learned together of, like, what can we do? What's the potential? And how we even have begun like serious and very effective cross-ministerial discussions. So I really want to compliment, and if you can send to your team our thank you and congratulations, because, moving it from 2015, when it showed up in a mandate letter and everyone said, what is social procurement, to, a few years later, and it's in the budget and an active pilots going forward. I'm going to move Victor over to you and ask you to introduce yourself and put in context how you see social procurement within the role and the efforts that you're doing, so through the social economy and through the BIPOC efforts.
Yes, absolutely, David. Thank you so much, as always, for your leadership. And I really want to thank the sponsors, the SAP channels, as well as S4ES. And it's always a pleasure to see you, Lorenzo. So my name is Victor Beausoleil. I'm the founder and executive director of SETSI, Social Economy Through Social Inclusion. And our work has been predicated on all things social innovation and all its subsets. So social economy, social finance, social procurement, social acquisitions, community economic development, and the cooperative movements, really trying to ensure that there's greater inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in all the aforementioned ecosystems. In terms of this conversation today, I believe that social procurement gives us a unique opportunity. One of my elders and ancestors, Bob Marley, said, in the presence of water, only the fool is thirsty. And I think that when you look at Lorenzo's statements around procurement and how big a file it is, there's a huge opportunity to not just level the playing field, but we can tilt it to ensure that underserved, marginalized, equity-seeking groups have access not just to resources and working capital, but can scale their social enterprises and, like you mentioned, David, acquire greater market share. So I'm definitely excited about the conversation. At SETSI, a lot of our work is predicated on monthly capacity building sessions, weekly Instagram lives. We have an incubator that supports 15 social purpose organizational leaders in partnership with ESDC and SEDNet. We also run a 6-month accelerator program. So these are some of the practical ways that we ensure that folks on the margins and the periphery of the economy have access to some of the intellectual property that usually manifest within conferences and in the halls of academia, and sometimes within governments, all 3 levels, but sometimes doesn't hit the margins the way it needs to. So our work is predicated on ensuring that no Canadian is left behind, and with a specific focus, obviously, on some of the groups that you mentioned earlier. So I'm excited about the conversation and definitely willing and able to help move the dial on this important file.
So Victor, I'm going to stay with you because Lorenzo asked for some pragmatic suggestions on what you think they can do. So I think we have a stage right now in a conversation that not only for Lorenzo, but I think what are the pragmatic things that we all have to look at? Because as you mentioned, this is an effort to not just level the playing field, but tilt the playing field so we get the outcomes we want. But what are, from your perspective, what are some of those efforts that have to take place in the corporate and in the federal level? Because I think today's conversation is really about that, right? Like, how do we work together? And so let's try to figure some of that out.
Absolutely. I think for me, the most important thing by far is ecosystem mobilization initiatives, models where we're bringing the good news, the gospel of social procurement to the masses. The average Canadian does not know what social procurement means. That's very problematic to such an emerging, incredible, and remarkable ecosystem. So I think finding ways and means for the federal, provincial, and municipal government to engage those that are traditionally and historically underrepresented or in some instances excluded, I think is very important. I think the other thing that would be prudent is the development of a pan-Canadian online platform. Right now, there's multiple models for validation and multiple models in which suppliers on both sides, demand and suppliers, engage. But a lot of times, some of these models are highly expensive. The accreditation processes are siloed. So creating models that have limited barriers and as well can connect diverse groups together, I think is really important. We've seen some good work coming out of the federal government, and obviously the mandate letter speaks to the leadership that we currently have. But the fact remains that the aforementioned ecosystems still lack a certain amount of diversity. That's why really hats off to Social Canada for this event today, because this is a very diverse group of social enterprises and organizations and leaders. And these are the type of steps that I think we need to take moving forward. So definitely, like I said before, ecosystem mobilization work, ensuring that folks aren't left behind, engaging those on the margins and the periphery of the economy around what social procurement is, scaling and supporting social enterprises to gather greater market share, but most importantly, creating that pan-Canadian online platform. Like it's so important, especially around the validation process.
Victor, that's quite a shopping list. It's great. Thank you. Lorenzo, we're going shopping at the federal government. You can't do everything. You got to prioritize, and it's going to take a lot of partners to achieve some of this, like the ecosystem stuff. So when you hear some of these suggestions, where do you think is the appropriate role for the federal government, and where do you see other partners coming in and supporting, this sort of ecosystem project? Because we can't expect any one sector to do it all. So how do you kind of perceive that partnership?
Well, that's a really good question, David, and I want to thank Victor for his participation and his ideas. Always great to be able to interact with you, Victor. And so to answer your question, David, I think that this is going to be an effort that's going to require the involvement of multiple groups in multiple different levels, jurisdictions, not just within the government, but also external partners, Social and other organizations and associations as we continue to move forward. I think the good news, as you were saying, David, is where we are today is different from where were even just 5 or 6 years ago. And I think that there has been great strides. To Victor's point, I think the concept of, social procurement or the ecosystem is not something that's well known, not just by Canadians, but I would even say within a lot of companies and even certain industries. It's a concept that's just starting to take root, but hasn't really put down solid roots as of yet. So I think a couple of things. One is I can speak about some of the things that we're doing on the procurement side, but I think that because this is an area that has so many impacts on so many different areas, it's going to require the involvement of numerous other people in different groups. Like at the federal level, certainly departments like Heritage Canada, our colleagues in Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada. There's going to need to be. We're going to need to bring to the table some of the expertise and knowledge across different groups, not just within the government but outside of it, in order for us to be able to advance. Because the idea of an online platform, I think, is a really interesting one. The challenge that we face is oftentimes we have a platform right now called buyandsell.gc.ca where the good news is you can go and get a ton of information on federal procurement. The bad news is the site has a ton of information on federal procurement. So sometimes, particularly some of the smaller companies will tell us it's really great that I have access to all this information, but the website can, sometimes be a little bit difficult to manage because there's just so much information out there. So how we create these platforms in a way where information is easy to find and digestible is one of the things that I think we need to kind of collaboratively work on together. And the idea of scaling social enterprises, I think, is something that we always need to keep in mind. But I'd like to be able to, from a procurement perspective, of course, what I want to make sure is that we're starting to focus on, first, diversifying our supplier base. So finding out who we're doing business with this from a federal contracting perspective, and then looking to be able to expand that to underrepresented groups, as Victor was indicating. So I think obviously there's still a lot of work to be done. But again, I think the good news is there is some positive momentum right now in this area, in this field. So I think the time is right for us to continue to push forward.
Victor, any response to those thoughts, or what are you thinking? Victor's muted.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Tori. Thank you, David. So I agree completely, Lorenzo. There's a lot of work that's needed. If you look at some of the champions that have emerged over the past few years, obviously David and Biosocial has been doing some great work, but there's a remarkable MP in Ontario, Ryan Turnbull, that's really pressed this thing forward. I think that we need to find ways and means inclusion, diversity, equity, and access is a start. It's not really the destination. The destination in this ecosystem is actually belonging. Having Canadians recognize that this is an emerging ecosystem that actually has some deep roots, but still isn't a household name, I think is really important. So when you look at some of the policies and legislation that has been put forward, finding ways and means to create accountability metrics, specifically around hitting the targets. It was very ambitious to carve out 5% as it relates to Indigenous groups, but was that target met? And what are the learning lessons from that specific model that we can leverage for other broader equity-seeking groups? I think this is something that's very important. Back to the Pan-Canadian online platform, I think that to diversify the supplier chain, to diversify the ecosystem, period, when you look at, and the government does great work, so the one thing I'm pretty sure we can all agree on is the government shouldn't be building websites. There's a lot of small organizations, agencies, institutions that have trouble navigating on some of these platforms. So finding platforms that are a lot more user-friendly, that are accessible, and creating models in which you can actually engage in meaningful discourse with Canadians around their ambition for what procurements will look like in the future, I think is another thing that's would be prudent of us, because like you said, we're talking about a national model, but where does Canada fall as it relates to the global and international model around procurement? We want to be leaders because we've always considered ourselves one of the best nations in the world. So I'm really inspired by some of the work I'm seeing, but I want to make sure that we don't fight just to get to a destination that may not be the fullness of the destination that's required, which is belonging. Folks belonging inside an ecosystem where they can scale their social enterprises, gain access to market share, and more importantly, support their families, pay their taxes, and be a remarkable citizens and constituents of Canada. But until we arrive there, it's going to be a lot of rhetoric and a lot of process and planning. So definitely the mandate letters are important to reflect on and do deep introspection on. More importantly, the budget that came out last week was very exciting, but we can't take our foot off the gas. We have to press, we have to push. So conversations like this are important, and I'm really waiting for next steps and more champions like the ones I mentioned earlier to find ways and means to scale the understanding of social procurements.
Thanks. Victor, I'll come back to you in a minute for our closing thoughts.
Thank you.
Lorenzo, anything closing? We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left.
So sure, David, I could spend another 20 minutes, but I just want to say first, thank you to Victor for the feedback and the views, and completely agree with all of them. We've got a journey that we need to go through, and we need to keep in mind the final destination, and we need to take steps to be able to get towards that. I'd be remiss, David, if I didn't spend maybe just 30 seconds letting everybody know about, for those who don't, about our Office of Small and Medium Enterprises. So the Office of Small and Medium Enterprises is an organization that is located across Canada, and we've got folks who are basically there to be able to help companies understand and participate in the federal procurement process. And they have been increasingly, and will continue to increasingly, focus on underrepresented groups, so that folks understand that the federal government might be buying, and probably is buying, the good or service that they're looking for, how to find those opportunities, and how to kind of participate in the federal procurement process. Because one of the things that I've been able to learn, I've had the honor and privilege of speaking with numerous companies across Canada, and one of the things that I've been told is that, a lot of times people are surprised at how different it is to sell to the government of Canada than it is to sell to the private sector. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, and I'm not going to get into it. But oftentimes companies just need to understand that the rules of the game when it comes to selling to the government of Canada are different than what they're used to in terms of selling to either individuals or other private sector companies. So the Office of Small and Medium Enterprises is there to be able to help companies understand how to do business with the federal government from a contracting perspective. And we really want to encourage any company, but especially those from underrepresented groups, to consider using OSME's services, which are available free of charge. And as I said, we have offices located across Canada. So recognizing how much time we have, David, I'll stop here and just say, again, thank you, because as always, it's always a pleasure and an honor to be able to participate in these Buy Social Canada events.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Victor, you've got 30 seconds for closing thoughts.
Yeah, just thank you so much, Lorenzo, for your brilliance and leadership as always. Tori, the Bisocial team, David. My closing thought is I think a lot of times humans, we know the price of everything, but sometimes the value of nothing. And I think it's really imperative that we just do that deep introspection to recognize that social procurement is about social value. And the deeper we understand social value, we'll recognize that we can support all Canadians through tools like social procurement. It just requires remarkable leadership and tenacity. So I appreciate all the folks that are here. We have a large group, and I'm really looking forward to connecting and building with all of you. Warm regards.
Great. I want to thank Victor and Lorenzo for helping set the stage, giving this broader picture, and the recognition that that is both micro efforts around things like we need platforms, we need training, and it's a macro effort. We need to look at what's the value we can create in the marketplace. And that journey has to include both micro efforts of what's the language in an RFP to that macro consideration of we're trying to change the purpose of the marketplace so that enthusiastically we can, in fact, use those buying opportunities to create social value. So Lorenzo, again, thank you. Victor, it's always great to spend time with you. Hopefully we'll have all of this in person at some time, but this is great that you can join us from Ghana, Victor, and Lorenzo from Ottawa, and I'm in Vancouver. So we have that value we can take away. Thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it back to Tori.
Great. Thank you, David. Thank you both, Lorenzo and Victor. And just to conclude the panel, I'd like to invite Lorenzo for you to choose a number between 1 and 201.
1 and 201? That's pretty specific. Let's go 178.
178. Okay, so the winner of a mug from Bisocial Canada with our new logo on it is Shagufta Pasta. So congratulations, Shagufta. We'll be in touch. There's the beautiful mug. Thank you for showing, David. And thank you so much, Lorenzo and Victor. It was wonderful to hear you speak today. Next up, we will have the panel of leading municipalities connecting to communities with purchasing with our moderator, Maham Tarar from Bisocial Canada. We're all going to leave the stage. There'll be a pause, and then the next session will begin. So thank you so much.